Hello everyone, this is Ojas Chaudhary and I welcome you all to the Eye of Science. Today we are going to talk about the most important theory in the history of biology, the cell theory.
So the year was 1839 and the place was Germany. Cell theory was published in the paper which entitled Microscopic Investigations on the Similarity of Structure and Growth in Plants and Animals. But the history of the cell theory dates back to 1665. So let's go back to 1665 when Robert Hooke had developed his own microscope which looked somewhat like this. And he did some observations on the cork cells and drew some diagrams of the cork cells which he observed from his microscope which looked like this. He published his findings in his book which titled Micrographia, or some physiological descriptions of minute bodies made with magnifying glasses with observations and inquiries thereupon. In its chapter 18, Observe, or the schematisme or texture of cork and cells and pores of other such frothy bodies, he first ever time told about cells. This was the first ever time somebody had told about the cells in the history of biology. But Robert Hooke didn't knew that what actually cell was. He didn't knew that what was its function. So he regarded it as the passage for conducting fluid. But we know today that they are more than that. Then let's go to 1674, 9 years later, when Anton von Leeuwenhoek, a shopkeeper, made his own microscope and observed several kind of things, and then he discovered bacteria and protista, which according to him looked like animals, like small animals, so he named them animalcules. Then for nearly 150 years there was no prominent work in the field of cell biology, when in 1824, Dutrochet, who was a French chemist, gave the idea of cell theory, but he did not formulate a cell theory, but he gave an idea that there can be a cell theory in the future. Then let's go to 7 years later, when in 1831 Robert Brown discovered the nucleus in the cell. Then nearly 4 years later, in 1835, Turgeon noticed a semi-fluid substance which was living in the cells, and he named it as sarcode, and which was named as the protoplasm later on in 1839 by Purkinje, and later on it was also confirmed by von Mohl years later. Now the work of cell theory started in the year 1838 when a German botanist named Matthias Jakob Schleiden, he did many observations on the plant tissues, and he came up to a conclusion that all plant tissues are made up of cells. He made his observation. Then in the same year, another German zoologist whose name was Theodor de Schwann, he also made some observations but on animal tissues, and he found that the animal cells and the plant cells are not structurally, compositionally, biochemically very different, except that the plant cells have a cell wall whereas animal cells do not. This was his interpretation of the plant cell and the animal cells. So in 1838 he gave an hypothesis that all plants and animals are composed of cells and their products. This was the first time that a scientist had told a statement like this. Then in the next year, in the 1839, the two of them collaborated and formulated the cell theory which they published in the paper which entitled Microscopic Investigations on the Similarity of Structure and Growth in Plants and Animals. Now the cell theory which was published by Schwann and Schleiden consisted of three main points. The first one was that all organisms are made up of cells and their products. The second one was that cell is the basic unit of life. which means that cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. Now these two are correct. But the third one was that cells are formed by a process which is similar to crystallization, which means that they are saying that the cells are formed by spontaneously. And we know that the third point is clearly wrong. But no one knew at that time that how the cells were formed. So it was assumed to be correct when 16 years later Rudolf Virchow entered the field and corrected it. He gave a statement which went controversial over the years until Louis Pasteur proved the statement, and the statement was omnis cellula e celluli, which means all cells arise from pre-existing cells. Now this statement went controversial because this was against the beliefs of the church, or according to him life was formed spontaneously, but it was proved by Louis Pasteur in 1862 with the help of his famous swan neck flask experiment. The example of cell theory clearly illustrates how scientific methodology works, where you first make some observations, and on the basis of those observations you give your own hypothesis, and then you test your hypothesis that whether it is wrong, whether it is correct, whether it is consistent with your further observations, and if it is consistent then you formulate your own theory. As the time passes, you realize that some points of the theory are wrong, or some needs to be updated, some needs to be more edited, then you modify your theory. And this is clearly illustrated by our cell theory. You first did some observations by Schleiden and Schwann, then Schwann gave an hypothesis, then they both collaborated, they worked on it, they developed into a theory, and then they made some modifications, and then the final cell theory came up to its shape as it is now. Now this was all which I had to tell about the cell theory, how it was formed and how it developed. Now why I chose this theory? I chose this because although it is very simple, but it is very fundamental, very central, very important to our understanding of biology. Because if we didn't knew what cell theory exactly is, we cannot study biology. It has so much importance in the whole of biology. Let's meet in the next video. Till then, okay, bye.